where it got started from was I was doing my own FOIL requests as a concerned citizen and getting the runaround, as we frequently do. I was going to my town board meetings and seeing them not complying with the open meetings law, and I would send them emails and try to point out to them they're not doing it correctly. And I thought there must be other people like me out there with these issues. And occasionally I would see in the newspaper, someone out in Tonawanda, was complaining at a meeting. Someone in Niagara Falls was complaining about, something, or a reporter would write an article about their FOIL requests not being responded to. So I thought maybe we could form a group to get people working on this together. And I found the National Freedom of Information Coalition, which has a great website, still in existence, and they have a map, and they showed all across the country organizations like the New York Coalition for Open Government. And I thought, well, geez, this is interesting. But I didn't have the courage to do a statewide group. I said, I don't think I can do this statewide. So actually, we first started in the town of Amherst. We first formed an Amherst Open Government Committee, convinced the town to do it, did that for a little bit. And then I decided to form the Buffalo-Niagara Coalition, just Erie and Niagara County. So that's what we did in 2017. And I wasn't sure if there was going to be any interest out there. I had cobbled together an email list of people I thought might be interested. I sent out a press release. And actually, our first meeting was at the offices of the Partnership for the Public Good, downtown Buffalo. I was trying to figure out where could I do this. And they said, do it here, it'd be fine. I wasn't sure if I was going to sit there by myself, but fortunately, Rod Watson, a reporter from the Buffalo News, wrote a great article about it like a couple days before the meeting, not after the meeting, which really wouldn't have been that helpful, but before the meeting, he wrote a great article, and 30 people came to that first meeting. I was really shocked. The attorney for the Buffalo News, who was a really knowledgeable person, came. People from Niagara County came. People from all over Erie County. So right at that first meeting, we had 30 people show up. We started having monthly meetings, doing press conferences, issuing reports. And then in 2020, we said, why don't we go statewide? Just before the pandemic, in January of 2020, we changed our name to the New York Coalition for Open Government. I wasn't sure how are we going to do this as a statewide group? How are we going to meet? Then the whole world shut down, and I had never done Zoom before, but it was kind of good timing in that regard because, well, now we started having Zoom meetings, which we still do today, and we have members from all across New York State that meet on a regular basis. You can check out our website at nyopengov.org. We've handed out some information regarding some of the things we're working on and where you can get more information. So that's a little bit of history, so let me tell you a little bit of history about the Freedom of Information Law, which is really kind of interesting as to how we got here. And I'm going to take you way back to the 1500s. So when the printing press was invented in the 1500s, it caused quite an uproar. It was amazing that people could now print pamphlets and information and get distributed much wider. Well, that was a concern for the church. The church was concerned about information getting out there, and the Pope in 1501 issued a directive that all written communications had to be approved by the church before it was distributed. And, from time beginning, those in positions of power don't like to be criticized and don't like to be questioned. And the church at that point tried to put a clamp on the printing press and what was distributed. Go ahead a little bit more, 1690, colonial America, the first newspaper came out in Boston. And in the first issue, there was an article critical of the British government. 4 days later, they shut it down. The British government wanted all newspaper articles pre-approved before they were released. People in power don't like to be questioned and don't like to be criticized. 1766, Sweden was the first country in the world to pass a Freedom of Information law, a law that was supportive of a free press. Actually, they beat us to it, 1766. A couple years later, James Madison wrote the First Amendment, and he's the founder of our Constitution in many ways, the founder of our constitutional rights. And Madison had a great quote, which is, "The truth is that all men having power ought to be mistrusted." And that's really, in large part what the First Amendment is about. We have the ability to question, we have the ability to criticize, we have the ability to ask for information. So although Sweden passed that in 1766, it took another 200 years before the United States passed the Freedom of Information Law. Amazingly, in many ways. And Lyndon Johnson passed that law in July 4th, 1966, the Freedom of Information Law. He hated it. He didn't want to sign it. Bill Moyer, his press secretary, has a great quote. I'll read it here. "LBJ had to be dragged kicking and screaming. He hated the very idea of open government, hated the thought of journalists rummaging in government closets, hated them challenging the official view of reality." LBJ, when he signed it, there was no signing ceremony. He was angry. He called up Moyer afterwards and he said over the phone, "I signed the effing thing." He didn't want to do it. He felt like he had no choice because newspapers across the country were calling for it, editorial boards, everything else. And unfortunately, many government officials today feel the same way LBJ did. They don't like it. They don't like being questioned. They don't like being criticized. They don't want you digging around and asking for information from the village level up to the president level. It's just, unfortunately, the culture that exists in many government places. So the way we got to the federal law is we owe a great debt of gratitude to a congressman named John Moss from California. Moss was from Sacramento. He got elected in 1952. He was flabbergasted that as a congressman, he couldn't get information from governmental agencies. He was asking for information, they wouldn't give it to him. And he was like, as a congressman, if I can't get this, how can anybody else get it? This is ridiculous. He started working with news reporters who complained to him as well, same things. In 1954, he introduced the first Freedom of Information law. It took him 12 years and 3 presidents to get it passed. Fortunately, he did not give up. To his credit, he was very persistent. He held public hearings. He convinced the Speaker of the House to name him the chair of a subcommittee. It wasn't even a committee, but the subcommittee, a government information committee. He held hearings. At those hearings, every federal agency that came spoke against the law. They didn't want it. There was attempts to shut his committee down. There was attempts to defund his committee. He was annoying a lot of people that just wanted it to stop. And unfortunately, to his credit, he stuck with it. LBJ signed the law. A couple years later, the effort started in New York. In 1970, New York was one of 5 states that did not have a Freedom of Information law. California actually did it in 1953. 1970, New York was one of the last holdouts. New York, by the way, was one of the last states in the country to pass an open meetings law. You know who was first? Believe it or not, Mississippi. New York, one of the last states in the country, which just shows you, again, the tradition and the history and the culture in this state of resisting it. There was an assembly member from Syracuse, John Terry, a Republican, who introduced the Freedom of Information law in 1970. About a year or 2 later, he got elected to Congress, which he only served 1 term. It was interesting. He did not like commuting from Syracuse to Washington, didn't like how it took time away from his family. He quit. He didn't run again for Congress, went back to just practicing law. And I think he died in like 2001. But after John Terry left, another Republican assembly member from Watertown picked up the bill. Donald Taylor was his name. And like Moss, Taylor held hearings. And just like at the federal level, every single state agency showed up and spoke against it. They didn't want it. The only person that spoke in favor of the law in New York State was a representative from the New York Civil Liberties Union. Thankfully to them, they were the only one. There were letters submitted from the court system. The Association of Towns was against it. The New York Conference of Mayors was against it. The New York State District Attorneys Association was against it. The same people who give us a hard time in large part today. But fortunately, it passed. Governor Malcolm Wilson in New York approved the law. It went into effect September 1st, 1974. So this is the 50th anniversary. When the law was first put into effect, it was different in that records were presumed to be closed, except for some exceptions that were open, and the public had the burden of proving why the record should be released. Fortunately, newspaper reporters, again, the media made an issue. This is ridiculous. This is backwards. This is not how this should be. And in 1977, they changed the law to what we have today, which is all records are presumed to be open. There's a few exemptions. And it's the government that has to prove why the record should not be released. So it was a big switch in the law that's still in effect today. But as we know, it's too hard. The system in many ways is broken. There's still resistance. People in power don't like to be questioned, don't like to be criticized, don't like to share information, a long history. So we still deal with it today. It's a nonpartisan issue. We have here today a Republican supervisor, a Democratic mayor who are in support of open government. But I got to tell you, both parties are bad at it. It's just a matter of who's in charge. If the Democrats are in charge, the Republicans are all for open government. When the Republicans come in charge, suddenly it flips. Now the Democrats are all for open government. So both parties are bad at it. We have some few exceptions. So that's kind of the history of how we got here.